I Am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Genre, sci-fi, action, adventure, fantasy. Chapter 421, Internal Network. Due to genetic encryption, the external world had no knowledge of the internal structure of the swarm's bioweapons and was thus unaware that the atomic furnace was the primary factor in creating the environment for the growth of longevity plants. The swarm's explanation that there weren't enough Godzillas to support widespread cultivation seemed reasonable. After all, it was well documented that the swarm did not produce nuclear waste, something easily verified through observation. Moreover, longevity plants were discovered in Godzilla nests, as detailed in official records. Lastly, Godzillas, as massive and cumbersome terrestrial units, genuinely didn't require mass production. Additionally, the response formally acknowledged Godzilla as a swarm creation, addressing some previous ambiguities. While minor flaws remained, it was a significant improvement over earlier explanations. Upon receiving the swarm's reply, the G-Race expressed their desire for the swarm to increase the number of Godzillas to boost the production of longevity plants. However, they understood that such a request was not enforceable and unlikely to be fulfilled. The production of a single Godzilla required an astonishing amount of resources. Spreading that cost across production made the longevity plants much more expensive. While the G-Race, as the issuer of points, wasn't particularly concerned about minor expenses, they foresaw that the demand for longevity plants would rise substantially in the future. If the price were inflated now, reducing it later would require significant effort and could disrupt the market. Thus, they refrained from pressing the swarm further and instead directed their orders to the Koya Alliance, neighbors located slightly further from the Riken system. Longevity plants, after all, were meticulously cultivated by Luo Wen. They were drought-tolerant, flood-resistant, corrosion-proof, and impervious to pests, diseases, and pesticides. Once the environment was prepared, all that was left was harvesting, making them extremely easy to grow. For the Koya Alliance, a coalition of civilizations focused on mechanical engineering, the immense amounts of nuclear waste they generated were a constant headache. Unlike the swarm, which could recycle waste, the Koya Alliance could only package it and hurl it into stars. To repurpose their waste into something valuable while openly participating in the longevity plant trade was undoubtedly an attractive proposition for them. Everything began falling into place. After completing construction projects for the Riken, several functional G-ships turned their attention to the swarm. They split into two groups, one started building quantum communication facilities in the neighboring star system, while the other moved to the Sandstorm system to oversee the construction of Trade City. The swarm's Trade City was likely the only one among foreign civilizations to place all major infrastructure underground from the start. It wasn't that other trade cities lacked underground structures. On the contrary, many of the older ones had underground complexes far larger than their surface counterparts after years of expansion. However, during the initial stages of construction, surface structures generally far outweighed underground ones. The swarm's decision to nearly exclude surface structures was unprecedented. Although the neighboring star system was only the second star system the swarm had entered, they weren't destructive developers. Planet neighboring still maintained a relatively pristine ecology, and the swarm had even planted forests on other rocky planets. From a distance, the lush, violet-tinged planets were a breathtaking sight. This system had been chosen as the swarm's public royal court, and its surveillance intensity was naturally elevated to the highest levels. Among the swarm's active species, the observer bugs prioritized stealth and privacy, making them nearly undetectable. To prevent foreign visitors from mistakenly believing the swarm's monitoring was lax, which might tempt them into rash actions, Luo Wen specially developed numerous observer bugs without optical camouflage, electromagnetic shielding, or sound dampening systems. These visible bugs served as a deterrent on the surface. Under this comprehensive system of overt and covered monitoring, the visiting G were exceedingly well behaved and refrained from crossing any lines. Still, some intelligence inevitably leaked out. Has today's request to access the swarm's intranet been approved yet? A G official aboard their ship inquired. No, the crew member replied succinctly. Ridiculous. This is the third application already. What's their excuse this time? The official fumed. An intranet of any civilization, from its inception to its growth, inevitably accumulates a vast amount of internal information. This data is pieced together over time, forming a tightly interwoven continuity that is exceedingly difficult to falsify or manipulate. Gaining access to a civilization's intranet could reveal a trove of information, such as its history, culture, customs, beliefs, population numbers, density, and demographic structure. While the civilization itself might find these details trivial, other civilizations could use them to deduce vulnerabilities and exploit them strategically. For instance, after gaining access to the Riken intranet, the G learned not only the aforementioned information but also uncovered critical data such as the number, locations, and scales of colonies, active warship statistics, troop compositions, and their distribution. It even led to the discovery of valuable resources like longevity serum. This method of reconnaissance was one of the G's most effective tools for understanding emerging powers. However, when it came to the swarm, they had hit a wall. They're giving the same excuse as before, the swarm doesn't have an intranet, the crew member remarked with a hint of sarcasm. Who do they think they're fooling? A civilization at this level of development not having an intranet? Impossible, the G official roared in frustration. In truth, this misunderstanding wasn't Luo Wen's fault. The swarm did have an intranet, but its access level was so restricted that only insiders could connect to it. Luo Wen was open to welcoming these G into the fold as insiders, but the conditions were far from ideal. After all, these individuals couldn't simply disappear for extended periods without raising suspicion. Fortunately, Luo Wen hadn't come away empty-handed during this period. On the ecological planets, the G personnel didn't need bulky spacesuits, just a filtration mask sufficed. This meant their skin was often exposed, allowing the swarm to collect genetic samples. Moreover, the neighboring star system wasn't even the primary focus. The real treasure trove lay with the Riken, where an influx of researchers had arrived, representing no fewer than 50 to 60 different species. Luo Wen had already devised a tiny bug specifically designed to collect samples like hair and skin flakes from these individuals. While the swarm network was a key asset, the swarm also had a public-facing intranet. However, as previously mentioned, a civilization's intranet carries enormous amounts of sensitive information. Since the swarm hadn't undergone a traditional process of organic growth from inception to maturity, fabricating a seamless and flaw-free history for their public intranet was an insurmountable challenge. Initially, Luo Wen's intent in creating this intranet was to establish a simulated swarm society to handle situations like the current one. However, he soon realized the workload was astronomical and ultimately abandoned the project. The intranet then became Luo Wen's personal storage for game saves. After all, the swarm network didn't support gaming. Thus, calling it an intranet was a stretch, it was more like a massive gaming website. Naturally, such a system couldn't be open to the G. The potential embarrassment alone made the idea laughable. Luo Wen decided it was better to claim the swarm didn't have one at all. Problem solved. Chapter 422, Seeking a Breach. You still haven't found a way to forcibly access their intranet. The G official was clearly unwilling to give up. Since the new G race inherited the G name, hundreds of thousands of years had passed. During that time, they had encountered civilizations similar to the swarm unwilling to let the G or any other foreign power access their intranets. However, weakness was the original sin. Fragile, fledgling civilizations stood no chance against the G's overwhelming technological superiority. What those civilizations believed to be foolproof intranet defenses often proved utterly meaningless in the face of the G's capabilities. But the swarm was fundamentally different from any stubborn civilizations they had faced before. Not yet, sir. I'm sorry, admitted a G crew member, bowing his head in shame. He often boasted about his exceptional hacking skills, but the current situation made him look like a clown. Useless. The official cursed and flung a cup at the wall in frustration. He had been tasked with achieving results, but with more than half the project already completed, his team had made no progress whatsoever. Sir, perhaps the swarm is telling the truth. Maybe they really don't have an intranet, a technician suddenly interjected. What? Are you an idiot now too? No intranet, do they communicate telepathically? The G official was fuming. He couldn't believe someone under his command would suggest such a naive idea. Any civilization that advanced beyond a certain level and accumulated sufficient knowledge would inevitably require an efficient means of information transmission. Relying solely on memory was impossible. For instance, just the theoretical framework for a warp drive would take eons to record even with rapid transcription devices. But they don't even have communication satellites. Our instruments haven't detected any network signals. At this point, we don't even know where the entrance is, let alone how to breach it, the technician argued, convinced that the issue lay with the swarm and not their own methods. The swarm follows a biological pathway. Who says they need communication satellites to transmit information? Those giant creatures floating in the sky could easily serve as biological communication relays. Stop making excuses for your incompetence. Right now, immediately, think of a solution. I don't want to hear any more about what can't be done. I want results. Otherwise, none of you will have a good time. The official was on the verge of losing his temper. His technicians seemed to have completely lost their edge, coming up with ridiculous excuses. The swarm conducted long-distance transmissions regularly, data that the G had managed to intercept on occasion. While their unique primary color encryption rendered the content undecipherable, it at least confirmed that the swarm possessed an information transmission system. The problem wasn't that the swarm lacked a network. The problem was that the G had yet to find the door. Once they did, the G's technological prowess would make breaking into the swarm's intranet a matter of minutes. There was no way the intranet's entire contents could be encrypted. Unfortunately, despite deliberately slowing down their construction progress to buy time, the G made no breakthroughs. By the time the project was completed, their technical team was left questioning their own abilities, utterly demoralized. During this time, the G weren't entirely passive. They attempted to physically infiltrate swarm habitats to gather intelligence. However, they quickly discovered that challenges were everywhere. Although they knew the planet must conceal numerous swarm hives, G ships couldn't conduct large-scale scans, and the swarm's underground tunnels were shielded by magnetic fields, rendering small scanning devices ineffective. As a result, the G didn't even know where the swarm's hives were, let alone how to infiltrate them. Even if they had precise locations, figuring out how to avoid the omnipresent observer bugs in the sky posed another significant challenge. These creatures, whose exact nature, whether living or something else, the G couldn't comprehend, left them stumped. In an effort to study the observer bugs, the G orchestrated an accident, successfully capturing a small observer bug and placing it in a specially designed container to prevent it from raising an alarm. However, when they tried to dissect it, they encountered the same awkward situation that the Reincarnated had faced before. The moment a probe pierced the bug's body, its genetic material collapsed, reducing it to a pool of viscous liquid. Undeterred, the G conducted several more attempts until they received a stern warning from the swarm, which forced them to stop. Frustrated and resentful, the G construction team eventually left, heading to the Sandstorm system to rendezvous with their colleagues and stay there for a while. Unfortunately, their counterparts in the Sandstorm system had made similarly little progress. The Sandstorm system was even more primitive than the neighboring star system. In the days that followed, everything seemed calm. Luo Wen waited for the next move from the mastermind behind the scenes, but no follow-up actions materialized. It was as if the swarm had been entirely forgotten. Years later, the swarm's trade city was completed and inspected, prompting the G vessels to leave swarm territory and return to the Reincarnated system. Unlike the cold treatment they had received from the swarm, the Reincarnated system had been transformed into a bustling research hub. It was said that considerable progress had been made in recent years, and several finished products had been developed thanks in no small part to Luo Wen's covert assistance. With increasing mastery over himself and the swarm network, Luo Wen manipulated node units with precision. Remote-controlled genetic mutations during experiments became second nature to him. His interventions were seamless, leaving no trace behind. Time marched on, and nearly a century passed in relative tranquility. During this time, Luo Wen observed nothing suspicious within swarm territory that could be considered a follow-up action from the mastermind. This eerie quiet made him question the validity of his previous assumptions. However, Luo Wen quickly dismissed such doubts. While his biological age was vast, his mental age was still relatively young. Over the years, he had gathered substantial information from various sources, including the G and other civilizations. In civilizations with histories spanning hundreds of thousands of years, records often documented plans and schemes that took centuries or even millennia to unfold. Some plans even spanned tens of thousands of years, crossing multiple generations. By comparison, the mere 100 years of silence around the swarm hardly seemed unusual. Yet the uncertainty of being a piece on the chessboard without knowing the next move weighed on Luo Wen. Meanwhile, the Reincarnated system's newfound prosperity, bolstered by the G's presence and experimental output, attracted even more outsiders. Although the finished products were technically G creations and had little direct connection to the Reincarnated, many production processes heavily involved the Reincarnated people. These products became items of trade within the trade city, generating tax revenue. The city had expanded multiple times, and the massive influx of personnel fueled the Reincarnated economy and accelerated their progress. On this foundation, the Reincarnated grew stronger. As strength grew, so too did ambition. Backed by the G and their laboratories, as well as extensive foreign interaction, the Reckon were emboldened. If a war were to break out in the Reckon system, it would implicate not just a few factions but an intricate web of interests. Feeling untouchable, the Reckon now sought to achieve more. Their first demand was complete control over the Reckon system. Chapter 423, Schemes. If there was any development over the years that could be attributed to the behind-the-scenes manipulator, it was likely the chaos surrounding the Reckon. Although the swarm had released all the Daki prisoners, it appeared to gain no gratitude in return. As the only failed invitation case in the history of the Interstellar Technological Confederation, Daki had become a laughingstock after the story spread, permanently etched into the annals of history. The returned prisoners seemed to amplify this humiliation, adding a debuff to the Daki civilization and making their shame even more glaring. Perhaps because of this, the swarm's relationship with the Koya alliance despite no direct conflict remained strained. When the Daki failed to recruit the Reckon into their alliance, they didn't give up and had been engaged in constant minor schemes over the years. While the Reckon were the original inhabitants of the Reckon system, they did not possess ownership over the entire system. Their territory included only Planet Reckon, Planet Riven, Planet Raiwu, and Cloud Return Planet, along with their respective moons. The rest of the vast system was controlled by the swarm. This left the Reckon with relatively scarce resources. Although the swarm allowed them to mine asteroids on the system's periphery, they were required to transport the materials back to their own territory. However, the Reckon lacked the capacity to tow large asteroids, and moving smaller ones required crossing swarm-controlled regions. This process was subject to layers of approval and regulation, creating a system that was not only highly restrictive but also deeply inconvenient. Any goodwill stemming from the swarm's mercy in the past had long since eroded with time. Adding to the tension, certain unidentified forces in the media stirred public opinion, framing the swarm as antagonistic toward the Reckon. This strained relationship was in stark contrast to the close bond that had developed between the Reckon and the Koya alliance, a faction that had previously extorted the Reckon but was now their ally. Under the guise of trade, the Koya alliance provided the Reckon with significant amounts of basic raw materials and technological assistance, enabling the Reckon to build a fleet of over 10,000 ships. The two sides cooperated in other areas as well. Many Reckon industries opened to the Koya alliance, and some media outlets that incited discord between the Reckon and the swarm were indirectly supported by Koya. At this point, the Reckon were outwardly neutral but had effectively become de facto allies of the Koya alliance. Now, emboldened by Koya's encouragement and support, the Reckon aimed to take control of the entire Reckon system. Even so, their ambitions were laughable. While their fleet of 10,000 ships was several times larger than what they had fielded in their past confrontation with the swarm, it was still utterly insufficient. At this stage, any attempt to challenge the swarm would be nothing short of a fool's dream. The Daki's fleet of 50,000 ships had been obliterated with just one volley from the swarm before they fled in disgrace. The Reckon's 10,000 ships wouldn't even make a ripple in the face of such power. The only way they might stand a chance was if the Koya alliance intervened with full force, sending their entire military. But that was unlikely. The Reckon were hardly indispensable to the Koya, and risking an all-out war with the swarm over a relatively insignificant ally was not something the Koya alliance would entertain. The Koya alliance, with its numerous members, long history, and vast population, had a much deeper understanding of the Interstellar Technological Confederation's rules and far more experience navigating its systems. With the Koya alliance advising them, the Reckon chose not to confront the swarm in direct, head-on conflict. Instead, they pursued a more insidious strategy, appealing to sympathy and seeking external support through the manipulation of public opinion. Their entry point into this strategy was highly calculated. Before the swarm and Reckon joined the Confederation, all fledgling civilizations were protected by established rules. These regulations prohibited outside interference until a civilization reached a certain stage of development. Even when such civilizations were later invited to join the Confederation, their losses were generally limited to small populations, knowledge, or cultural artifacts. Territorial losses were uncommon because uninhabited star systems in the outer ring were not particularly valuable. In fact, it became customary for fledgling civilizations to retain ownership of their home star systems, with the G eventually codifying this into official regulations. This approach not only fostered goodwill among younger civilizations, shifting resentment toward their invitees, but also ensured that these civilizations remained robust enough to serve as worthy competitors for the older factions. It was a win-win for the G. Before the emergence of the Swarm and the Reckon, no faction had ever weaponized this rule. However, the G and other factions never anticipated the rise of a force like the swarm. It seemed to come out of nowhere, conquering a star system and reaching the heart of its opponents in just over a century. The G had been caught flat-footed, still in deliberations about the situation. By the time they were ready to act, the swarm had already established dominance, leaving the current status quo in place. Interestingly, the Reincarnated, a civilization without full sovereignty over their home star system, didn't seem to align with the Confederation's regulations. Yet the swarm's occupation of Reincarnated territory occurred before either faction joined the Confederation, meaning it didn't violate any existing rules. This was an unforeseen loophole in the regulations. Given the G's obsession with precision and order, such flaws in their rules were intolerable and would undoubtedly be rectified. The Koya Alliance and the Reincarnated seized on this opportunity. Their goal was to manipulate public sentiment and pressure the G into amending the rules in a way favorable to the Reincarnated. If successful, the swarm would be faced with two unpalatable choices. Should they refuse to comply, they would risk alienating not just the Koya Alliance but also the G themselves. Regardless of the G's preferential treatment toward the swarm, they would feel compelled to enforce the rules for the sake of their reputation and centuries-long authority. This could force the G into direct conflict with the swarm, allowing the Koya Alliance to eliminate the swarm without lifting a finger. On the other hand, if the swarm complied, their image would take a severe hit. This would enable the Reincarnated to establish independence and align with the Koya Alliance. At the same time, it would isolate the swarm within the Confederation, limiting their opportunities for growth and development. Either way, as long as the plan proceeded smoothly, the Koya Alliance would benefit immensely. However, the Koya Alliance lacked the influence to generate such widespread attention on their own. Even if they had the means, they wouldn't risk openly antagonizing a powerful force like the swarm. Publicly stepping into the fray wasn't their intention. Their preferred tactics were more underhanded, sowing discontent, fanning the flames from the shadows, and letting others take the heat. The Reincarnated began flooding the Confederation's internal news networks with distorted narratives, recasting themselves as weak, helpless victims while subtly painting the swarm as oppressive aggressors. They rewrote history, portraying the swarm's actions as unjust violations, hoping to elicit sympathy from other factions. Thanks to the quantum communication system, these stories spread instantaneously across the Confederation. Some civilizations dismissed them with a scoff, but others viewed them with keen interest. Chapter 424, Doubts. Luo Wen's curiosity had always been intense, a trait that had often gotten him into trouble in the past. With the G's installation of quantum communication systems, keeping up with the gossip and news from various civilizations had become one of his favorite pastimes. Naturally, he had noticed the Reincarnated's recent public statements. However, Luo Wen didn't take them seriously. To be honest, without his approval, the Koya Alliance's plan wouldn't have gotten off the ground in the first place. Thanks to years of development and the Reincarnated's universal vaccination program, at least 200 million Reincarnated individuals were now disguised intelligent entities under Luo Wen's control, occupying 80% of the Reincarnated's military, political, and commercial leadership. They secretly controlled every facet of the Reincarnated's society. And that wasn't all. At least 50% of the Reincarnated population had undergone physical modifications, allowing Luo Wen to forcibly extract their spiritual entities from their bodies at any time. In essence, the rise or fall of the Reincarnated rested entirely in Luo Wen's hands. With such capabilities, Luo Wen considered the theoretical possibility of dominating the entire Confederation by spreading longevity serum universally. However, his calculations showed that even under optimal conditions, this process would take at least 10,000 years to complete, assuming there was no resistance from any civilizations. By that time, the swarm might already possess the sheer military power to overwhelm the Confederation directly. Surely, the mastermind wouldn't allow the swarm that much time to grow. When the Koya Alliance first approached the Reincarnated, Luo Wen had known about it. Initially, he dismissed it as a minor attempt to sow discord and decided to let events unfold, curious to see what tricks they would play. But as the Koya Alliance's plans became increasingly elaborate, Luo Wen sensed something was amiss. Could this be the long-awaited next step in the hidden manipulator's strategy? The more information Luo Wen uncovered, the more convinced he became that his suspicions were correct. He had begun to discern his opponent's methodology and had even pieced together a vague understanding of their ultimate goal. The Koya Alliance might have some insight into the truth, but it was far more likely that they, too, were merely pawns. Their so-called plan was almost certainly orchestrated and encouraged by the hidden manipulator. After all, there was no deep-seated enmity between the Koya Alliance and the Swarm. Conflicts between civilizations were far more complex than personal grudges. Impulsive decisions could lead to disastrous consequences, but a civilization's brain was composed of countless individual minds. Even if some were prone to rashness, the collective wisdom of others would pull them back from the brink. And for a coalition like the Koya Alliance, composed of over 20 civilizations, the minor grievances between the swarm and the Daki were insignificant. They were more likely to spectate and mock from the sidelines than actively intervene in such a dispute. As for alliance agreements, Luo Wen laughed at the thought. Through the Riken, he had reviewed these agreements himself. They weren't even proper defense pacts, barely more than mutual aid agreements for convenience. If the swarm had attacked the Koya Alliance outright, perhaps they would have united to resist. But in this case, it was the Daki who had initiated the conflict and bungled it so badly that they became a laughingstock, losing tens of thousands of crew members in the process. The notion that the Daki's actions were motivated by a desire to avenge their prisoners was laughable even to the Daki themselves. Luo Wen knew exactly what had happened to those prisoners after they were repatriated. The Daki prisoners, held captive by the swarm for over 60 years, did not return to a hero's welcome. Fearful of resentment and rebellion, the Daki government relocated them to a small colony world under the pretense of assigning them to guard duty. In reality, they were kept under semi-detention. As a result, the tens of thousands of intelligent entities embedded among them failed to gather any useful information. For Luo Wen, it was a disappointing investment. However, over the course of a century, a portion of these intelligent entities had been allowed to die through reasonable means, returning to the swarm network, where they finally served some purpose. The Daki's aggressive actions, therefore, could only be explained as an attempt to save face. However, the humiliation they endured had already been etched into history, and unless the Daki managed to reclaim their pride through direct military victory, their honor would remain irretrievable. Yet, curiously, the Daki seemed to suddenly rally together with unwavering resolve to destroy the swarm. Luo Wen found it impossible to believe this was happening without an invisible hand guiding events from the shadows. In the Interstellar Technological Confederation, some civilizations in the middle circle and even the inner circle had grown complacent. Their territories were entirely bordered by other member states, leaving them with little incentive to explore unclaimed star systems in the distant outer ring. The pioneering spirit of their ancestors had long since faded, replaced by an attitude of comfortable stagnation. These civilizations, immersed in their spiritual pursuits, often developed peculiar hobbies. Among them, certain factions took great pleasure in sympathizing with the weak. Under the guise of altruism, they intervened to help those they deemed vulnerable, achieving a sense of moral fulfillment in the process. These factions were typically well-resourced, far better off than many outer ring civilizations. With their long histories, they had established extensive social circles and influence within the Confederation. Moreover, their actions, while eccentric, rarely crossed the line, and their neighbors were content to let them indulge rather than risk turning them into competitors. For many, having a passive, non-expansionist neighbor was a dream come true. In this permissive environment, these factions had gradually become more domineering and capricious in their behavior. The Koya Alliance, aware of this dynamic, decided to target these civilizations. The Riken's plight, carefully orchestrated, became a trending topic in the Confederation's internal news network. Predictably, the unprecedented story captured the attention of these idle factions. Previously, such groups had limited themselves to helping endangered subspecies or saving near-extinct animal populations. A case involving an entire civilization in need of salvation was unheard of. The mere thought of such a grand cause was enough to give them an almost euphoric sense of purpose. As for the supposed oppressor, the swarm, how powerful could they be? The complacent factions, uninterested in relevant details, dismissed the swarm as mere outer ring primitives. The situation quickly grew bizarre. More and more old, established powers began stepping in, brandishing the banner of altruism. They called on the G to revise the rules, demanding better protections for weaker civilizations to ensure their healthy development. At this point, Luo Wen's earlier suspicions became absolute certainty. If he had been 80% sure of his hypothesis before, he was now 100% convinced. After all, the swarm was being labeled an outer ring upstart, so what was the Koya Alliance in comparison? They certainly didn't have the capacity to orchestrate a media storm of this magnitude. Clearly, the mastermind behind these events was immensely powerful, with influence not only among the G but also within other factions across the Confederation. But what were they after? With such strength, why the need for secrecy? The only plausible answer was that their ultimate target was the G themselves. But what role did the swarm play in this grander scheme? Luo Wen had a fairly good idea of their immediate objectives based on their recent actions. However, linking these objectives to their ultimate goal left him feeling as though something didn't quite add up. Chapter 425, The Visit. With too many missing pieces of information, Luo Wen was unable to connect the dots, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. After several days of trying to piece together his thoughts and finding no answers, he decided to set the matter aside temporarily, awaiting more information before drawing further conclusions. As for the Koya Alliance's plans, Luo Wen decided to cooperate. His reasons were several-fold. First, although Luo Wen controlled the Reikan, neither the Reikan themselves nor the Koya Alliance nor the Ji were aware of this. By all appearances, the Reikan had no reason or justification to reject the Koya Alliance's overtures. A sudden refusal without cause would be highly suspicious and draw unwanted attention. Second, the swarm was unable to directly retaliate. Now that the Reikan were members of the Interstellar Technological Confederation, they were protected by its rules. The swarm could not simply wipe them out. Furthermore, the Reikan were home to numerous G laboratories and foreign teams. Any attack on the Reikan would invite chaos and conflict, something Luo Wen was keen to avoid. Third, the Reikan were an essential production base for the swarm, contributing to Luo Wen's growth. Destroying them would be counterproductive. Luo Wen had no interest in sabotaging his own plans for strength. Finally, if the current scheme was merely Plan A, it was highly likely the hidden manipulator had additional contingency plans, Plan B or even Plan C. Allowing Plan A to run its course, even if already exposed, gave Luo Wen the opportunity to better understand his opponent and maintain some measure of control. Moreover, the Reikan themselves, under Luo Wen's control, were still heavily involved, providing an additional layer of oversight. Thus, as the swarm remained silent, the Confederation's public relations onslaught continued unabated. The swarm and the Reikan, two fringe civilizations, entered the spotlight. Even civilizations on the far side of the Confederation, tens of thousands of light-years away, began taking notice. The stories surrounding the swarm and the Reikan had now been spun into numerous variations. While the specifics varied, they all shared the same core narrative: the swarm was a tyrant, and the Reikan were a weak, oppressed civilization enduring hardship, humiliation and despair while courageously seeking protection. The tales were so compelling that even Luo Wen couldn't help but admire their creativity. Yet aside from the self-proclaimed altruists, few took the stories at face value. Civilizations with think tanks understood that no trending topic reached such heights by accident. For two minor outer ring factions to attract this level of attention, there had to be a hidden agenda. Most observers cared little about the swarm or the Reikan themselves, they were far more interested in the mastermind behind the scenes and their ultimate goal. As the narrative gained traction and the manipulator's influence spread, the Ji finally turned their attention to the issue. The Council of Elders convened to address the loophole in the rules, initiating deliberations on how to resolve the matter. At this pivotal moment, Elder Humes, who had spent nearly a century in the Reikan system, made an unexpected visit to the swarm, requesting an audience. "Your Majesty, it has been many years, and yet your radiance remains undiminished," Elder Humes greeted, his piercing gaze filled with curiosity. Though he had spent over 80% of the past century in cryosleep, the passage of time had still left its marks upon him. Yet the swarm's empress standing before him appeared completely unchanged from their last meeting. The highest leaders of civilizations were typically among the first to succumb to the ravages of time. Their responsibilities, filled with endless complexities, rarely allowed them the luxury of extended rest. But this phenomenon seemed utterly absent in the swarm empress. The Confederation was home to a species known as the potling. They retained their youthful appearance for 99% of their lives, only aging rapidly when nearing death. Time seemed to hold no sway over them. The swarm empress's appearance reminded Elder Humes of this peculiar trait, stirring his curiosity even further. If the swarm wasn't blessed with innate longevity like the potling, then their lifespans must far exceed ordinary expectations. The swarm remained shrouded in mystery. Their members seldom interacted with outsiders or revealed themselves publicly. Their origins, culture, history, societal structure, and even their lifespans were all enigmas. Some factions had attempted unconventional methods to pry into these secrets. For instance, 20 years ago, a ship carrying swarm and Reikan researchers stopped at a G outpost during its journey. Half of the personnel disembarked there, while the ship continued toward the G home world. Over the next 2 decades, nearly 500 swarm researchers at the outpost mysteriously disappeared. Considering there were only 1,500 swarm researchers on the ship to begin with, the loss of over 30% of them was staggering. Disappearing under such circumstances, while on G-controlled territory, bordered on absurdity. Officially, these swarm researchers had been sold to the G. Furthermore, the G ship's journey spanned 80 years and at least 500 light-years. Without quantum communication equipment, contacting their homeland was impossible. The missing swarm researchers, outnumbered and voiceless, could only endure their fate. However, Luo Wen knew exactly what had happened to them. As node units of the swarm, their every experience was accessible to him. Attempts by these factions to extract intelligence from the swarm researchers through special means were futile. The swarm's sophisticated safeguards ensured that no useful information could be gleaned. Elder Humes was aware of some of these incidents. As the only G elder directly engaged with the swarm, he occasionally received classified information about such events. From the G's perspective, the swarm's genetic achievements were unprecedented. Their unbreakable encryption technology was proof enough that the swarm might have surpassed the G in this field. The Skarian race, to which Humes belonged, had an average lifespan of just over 400 years, less than 500 even with frequent cryosleep and access to longevity serum. For someone like Humes, this was far from satisfactory. He wanted more. The swarm, Humes believed, might hold the key to solving the problem of lifespan. The swarm empress standing before him was evidence of that potential. But the swarm was a tough nut to crack. Humes knew he needed patience to achieve his goals, and the current situation might provide the perfect opportunity. Elder Humes, what brings you here this time? Sarah raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp, clearly expressing her dissatisfaction with the recent spate of slanderous public opinion targeting the swarm. Humes merely chuckled, unaffected. Such petty tactics had no impact on someone as seasoned as he was. Did they expect him to feel guilt over such trivialities? Since Sarah had dispensed with pleasantries, Humes saw no need for further niceties either. He got straight to the point. Your Majesty, regarding the historical disputes between your civilization and the Riken, our Council of Elders has already begun deliberations. As you surely understand, the current situation is less than ideal for your people. Chapter 426, The Request. Elder Humes glanced at Sarah's expression and noticed her complete lack of reaction. Suppressing a flicker of annoyance, he continued, I have a suggestion. I don't know if I should speak it aloud. Please, go ahead, Sarah responded curtly. Well, I have some influence within my race and a decent network of connections. If your Majesty needs it, I could help mediate and try to secure a favorable outcome for your people. Humes swayed his long neck slightly as he spoke with apparent conviction. And what would you require in return, Elder Humes? Sarah replied coldly. After all, there was no such thing as a free lunch. Humes had no familial ties to the swarm, yet here he was, eager to offer counsel. She was curious to see what this sly old fox had in mind. Your Majesty is so forthright, I admire that, Humes began with flattery. But truly, I have no personal desires, he added, attempting to project an image of selflessness. Sarah thought to herself, if you had no desires, why bother speaking? Of course, she couldn't voice this aloud, as it would offend both parties. Instead, she silently watched as Humes continued his act. When Sarah remained silent, Humes silently cursed her low emotional intelligence. Still, he couldn't afford to walk away now. He pressed on, saying, although I personally ask for nothing, there is a minor work-related matter where I hope your Majesty might assist me. Please elaborate, Sarah prompted with a nod. You may not know this, your Majesty, but my race places a great deal of importance on assessments. Even as an elder, I am subject to evaluation tasks, Humes explained, no longer beating around the bush. While the Confederation includes many foreign races, most of them follow technological paths influenced by my race. As a result, there is little unique technology left to trade or exchange. To be frank, when I first heard that your people had forged an entirely unique path, I was delighted. I staked my reputation and spent no small amount of resources to secure the position of negotiating an agreement with your people. Humes glanced at Sarah again but saw no reaction from her. She simply stared at him coldly. He sighed inwardly, feeling as if his vitality had been drained, and his voice took on a pitiful tone. Over a century ago, I was tasked with inviting your people to join the Confederation. But time has flown by, and after 100 years, your people have shown no interest in our exchange list. My evaluation period is now fast approaching, and because of this situation, my results are abysmal. Losing face would be the least of my worries, I might even lose my position as an elder. At this point, Hume seemed on the verge of tears. I beg you, Your Majesty, to lend me a hand. I swear, in return, I will do everything in my power to assist your people in the future. But Sarah remained utterly unmoved by his display. Anyone who had lived as long as Hume's wouldn't be prone to such emotional outbursts, and Sarah saw right through his act. Apologies, Elder Humes, Sarah replied, her tone firm. The items on the exchange list are critical secrets of our people. They will not be traded unless absolutely necessary. Humes touched the corner of his eye where tears might have been and thought bitterly, if this isn't a moment of absolute necessity, what is? Once the G modify their rules, you'll lose your territory, your reputation, and be ostracized as a bully preying on the weak. Of course, Humes wouldn't outright admit his true thoughts, it would ruin any pretense of diplomacy. Adopting an air of concern for the swarm, he said, perhaps your Majesty hasn't fully realized just how grave the current crisis facing your people truly is. He then launched into an elaborate and dramatic recounting of the dangers looming over the swarm. His speech was filled with alarming details, painting a dire picture. Your Majesty, the reason so many adversaries dare to target your people is because of a perceived lack of strength. By exchanging your unique technology, you would not only assist me in fulfilling my obligations, but also earn points. Despite the differences between your people's technological path and ours, the underlying theories are connected. By using points to acquire these theories, the swarm could bolster its own capabilities, deterring potential threats. Humes ended with what he considered his ace: I've personally gone to great lengths to update the exchange list on your behalf. You can now trade for technologies that do not involve any sensitive secrets of your civilization. With that, he handed over the new list to Sarah. Through Sarah's vision, Luo Wen glanced at the list. He had to admit, it was comprehensive. The additions were clearly tailored for the swarm. Most of the entries pertained to foundational knowledge, particularly problems the G had encountered while researching longevity plants. Luo Wen knew all about those difficulties. After all, he had been secretly observing the progress of their laboratories and occasionally helping by inducing subtle mutations in their experiments, making them believe they were achieving breakthroughs. The rest of the list contained conjectures related to genetics. Some of these were issues Luo Wen could easily resolve, others were beyond even his current capabilities. However, these hypotheses provided Luo Wen with insights and inspiration, making the list a valuable resource. Humes's eagerness reminded Luo Wen of his earlier speculations. Was this an indirect attempt to enhance the swarm's capabilities because it hadn't yet met the manipulator's expectations? This arrangement would indeed strengthen the swarm while also granting them access to some urgently needed technology, a win-win situation. At this moment, Luo Wen had a flash of clarity about the inconsistencies he'd been sensing. Humes's actions didn't align with the objectives Luo Wen had inferred from his earlier analysis of the hidden manipulator's plans. There were two possible explanations: either Humes was taking advantage of the situation, securing benefits for himself while shirking any real obligations. Or multiple factions could be working behind the scenes, each with its own agenda. Luo Wen leaned toward the latter. He couldn't help but sneer inwardly, so, they all see the swarm as a convenient stepping stone. Aren't they afraid of breaking their teeth on it? After careful consideration, Luo Wen decided to decline Humes's generous offer. First, the swarm's foundational technologies, such as primary color encryption and genetic encryption, were too critical to their survival and identity to be shared under any circumstances. As for the issues related to longevity plant research, Luo Wen was tempted to resolve all of them outright. However, doing so would expose too much about the swarm's capabilities and potentially open the floodgates for further unwanted attention. Moreover, Luo Wen was reluctant to have the swarm's name explicitly linked to longevity plant technology. If the plants were developed using a significant amount of swarm-based techniques, the civilizations benefiting from them might hesitate to use the technology, fearing hidden risks. Paradoxically, what seemed like a shortcut might ultimately backfire, slowing their progress instead of accelerating it. Luo Wen found it more effective to assist them covertly. Letting them believe their breakthroughs were entirely self-made would ensure smoother adoption and fewer complications. Chapter 427, Rule Revisions. The swarm's refusal took Elder Humes by surprise. Despite the swarm's unique talents, he had expected his status as a G elder, coupled with his deliberately humble demeanor and repeated requests, to yield a different result. To him, being turned down at this stage was nothing short of an insult. Though furious, Humes maintained a veneer of decorum. However, he wasted no time in departing from the swarm. Before leaving, he left a pointed remark. "Your Majesty, if the swarm continues to act this way, you'll find it difficult to make any friends." As the G vessel faded into the distance, Luo Wen chuckled. Judging by that old fox's expression, if the swarm weren't so inscrutable, he'd be rallying forces to dethrone you the moment he returned. His laughter quickly faded, replaced by a contemplative look. Sarah, standing nearby, appeared uneasy. "Overlord, was this really the right decision?" "It's fine," Luo Wen replied reassuringly. "But Humes will undoubtedly stir up trouble upon his return. I fear our forces in the Recon system might be compromised," Sarah said, her worry evident. Luo Wen shook his head. "Sarah, Humes is just another pawn. His will can't change anything. Offending him doesn't matter. But what about those he represents?" "That doesn't matter either," Luo Wen said calmly. "Even if we relinquish the Recon system to the Recon themselves, how does that harm us? In fact, I've been planning to use this situation as a pretext to withdraw the swarm from the Recon system entirely." "Why would we do that?" Sarah asked, confused. "The Recon system has too many outsiders now, and among them are plenty with malicious intent. Even a few years ago, some attempted to infiltrate swarm bases. Their actions have only grown bolder. The influx of people into the Recon system, spurred by the G laboratories and the thriving trade city, made it easy for troublemakers to slip in unnoticed." "Unacceptable. Can't we block their access to the system or outright make them disappear?" Sarah suggested angrily. The swarm controlled the Recon system's periphery, and every vessel entering or leaving Recon space had to pass through swarm-controlled territory. Technically, Sarah's proposal was feasible. But Luo Wen shook his head again. "That would be pointless. It would only create unnecessary enemies. Those pulling the strings behind the scenes would love nothing more than for us to do that, as it would give them even more justification to attack us." The swarm's current troubles with public opinion were already a lingering issue from history. On this matter, the swarm wasn't entirely in the wrong. However, if they were to block trade routes or harm Confederation personnel, they'd be handing their opponents a golden opportunity. The resulting backlash would make the current situation look trivial in comparison. Sarah understood the logic but couldn't hide her frustration. "Isn't there another way?" "Sarah, don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. If they approach us with goodwill and sincerity, we will reciprocate in kind. But if they attempt to humiliate us, we will remember and repay them accordingly. For now, though, we lack the strength to act. What we need most is time," Luo Wen said, pausing briefly before continuing. "Our current priority is to minimize our presence. They've used the issue with the Recon to push us into the spotlight, but arguments require two active participants. If we remain silent and handle this passively, the matter will fade soon enough." "But what if the manipulator doesn't give up?" Sarah asked. "As long as we avoid creating new incidents, these existing issues won't cause us any substantial harm. If they persist in their schemes, all they're doing is buying us time. I wouldn't mind if they keep this topic trending for centuries." Hearing this, Sarah and Luo Wen exchanged a knowing smile. Of course, Sarah had already considered these points. She was no stranger to the intricacies of such matters after living for centuries. But she also understood that Luo Wen sometimes needed to voice these thoughts to clarify his own perspective. Whether it was due to Humes's anger or the swarm's perceived insolence, the disputes between the swarm and the Recon remained the most discussed topic within the Interstellar Technological Confederation for an extended period. Increasing numbers of factions took an interest in the situation. For the Recon, this period was akin to becoming celebrities. Their officials and spokespersons were constantly occupied with interviews and statements, basking in the attention. In stark contrast, the swarm behaved as if completely detached from the outside world. They made no official responses, ignored all interview requests, and refrained from participating in any debates. This deliberate silence, manipulated by interested parties, further stoked resentment against the swarm. But the swarm left no openings for their detractors to exploit. In the Recon system, swarm forces had already scaled back operations. Foreign vessels that trespassed under the pretense of being lost were captured and unceremoniously expelled. This left those intruders at fault, not the swarm. As for attempts to infiltrate other swarm-controlled star systems, such endeavors were doomed to fail. Those regions were entirely closed to outsiders, and claims of accidental trespassing would hold no weight. Anyone who ventured there uninvited would simply be eliminated, with their deaths deemed inconsequential. The trade city, however, remained a potential weak point. Despite the limited range of products the swarm sold, their offerings such as the bound bioarmor were always in high demand, perpetually sold out. However, with the swarm showing no interest in foreign goods, the trade city's activity levels were far from bustling. While it did see occasional disturbances due to its status as a development zone, Luo Wen's orders ensured no significant incidents occurred. In this way, the swarm eluded all attempts to provoke or entrap them, slipping through the fingers of their adversaries like an elusive eel. Meanwhile, under the spotlight of public scrutiny, the G moved quickly. Within just 5 years, the Council of Elders reached a consensus and amended the relevant regulations. Unsurprisingly, the changes were unfavorable to the swarm, at least in the eyes of outsiders. The new rules mandated that the swarm withdraw from the Riken system within 20 years. The announcement was met with euphoric celebrations among the so-called altruists, who treated the decision as a triumph of righteousness. Numerous factions eagerly awaited the swarm's reaction, expecting anger, defiance, and potentially even formal appeals. Elder Humes, in particular, felt vindicated. "Ha! Let's see how arrogant you are now." Humes laughed uproariously, his long-simmering frustration finally dissipating. But the swarm didn't lodge any appeals or protests. Instead, they adopted a stance of passive compliance. The day after the announcement, they began withdrawing from the Riken system in earnest. Troops were recalled, supplies packed, and facilities dismantled, all with methodical efficiency. This behavior left many factions stunned. They had anticipated a fierce response from the swarm, hoping to ridicule them further when their appeals inevitably failed. Instead, the swarm robbed them of that opportunity entirely by leaving without resistance. Chapter 428, Coveted Secrets. Withdrawing entirely from a star system is a massive undertaking. After occupying such a system for centuries, any civilization would have built extensive infrastructure and relocated a significant population. Ordinarily, a civilization might require nearly a century to withdraw completely, and even that wouldn't be enough for a clean departure. The G's 20-year deadline for the swarm was clearly intended to be difficult, perhaps with ulterior motives. By forcing the swarm to rush their withdrawal, they likely hoped something would be left behind to examine. However, the swarm's personnel and unit structures were fundamentally different from those of mechanical civilizations, which greatly influenced the speed of their operations. The swarm didn't have the burden of countless individuals to evacuate, nor did they need to dismantle colonies. If they abandoned the fungal carpet and fixed defenses, the swarm could pack up and leave in mere days. Still, since the G had granted 20 years, the swarm intended to use the time to their fullest advantage. As the swarm began their withdrawal, various observation devices were deployed around key sites like Planet Rays, Planet Izumo, and the swarm's solar orbit bases. These devices came from different factions and civilizations, but they all shared the same goal: to exploit the swarm's departure to uncover its secrets. During such a large-scale operation, some valuable information was bound to be exposed. While the swarm couldn't entirely avoid this, they could do their best to minimize the damage. Nearly all of the swarm's spacefaring units and facilities were derived from, or compatible with, the fungal carpet. As they prepared to leave, the swarm integrated fixed-surface weapons like electromagnetic and energy cannons into their space octopuses. The size and number of these components made them impossible to conceal, but Luo Wen wasn't concerned. Such capabilities were achievable even by mechanical civilizations, so they didn't reveal anything particularly special. All subterranean units were quietly recalled, avoiding any exposure. Even brood queens were dismantled and their materials repurposed to create more space octopuses. As for the fungal carpet, Luo Wen hesitated. Initially, he considered leaving it behind, hoping it might be overlooked. However, he quickly realized that the G and other factions would never mistake it for a natural plant. They would undoubtedly dissect and study it, and when its genetic structure collapsed, its artificial nature would be exposed. Deciding it was better to avoid unnecessary risks, Luo Wen ordered the complete removal of the fungal carpet. It retracted underground, consuming itself in the process, and its energy was converted into space octopuses. Despite the withdrawal, the swarm didn't entirely abandon the system. Deep within the planetary crust, numerous fungal carpet seeds and brood queen eggs were carefully buried. These were highly condensed microversions with exceptional concealment abilities, making them almost impossible to detect. Only Luo Wen knew their locations, as finding them would be exponentially harder than searching for a needle in a haystack. The only remnants left behind were the vast underground networks the swarm had constructed over centuries. With much of the material already absorbed, restoring the terrain to its original state was impossible. As the fungal carpet withdrew, many areas lost structural support and began to collapse. However, some sections of the network stubbornly remained intact. Luo Wen could only continue destroying and burying the remnants of the underground networks. As time passed, the formerly violet-gray planets began to fade, gradually regaining their original hues. However, the surfaces were marred by countless depressions and basins caused by the collapse of subterranean tunnels. Luo Wen's predictions proved accurate. Following the rule changes and the swarm's silent compliance, coupled with their careful handling of the situation, there were no new opportunities for their adversaries to attack. Interest in the swarm-Riken dispute waned, and public attention shifted elsewhere. However, Luo Wen knew this peace was only temporary. It was only a matter of time before another wave of trouble came their way. To his surprise, though, nothing significant occurred. It seemed that the factions pulling strings behind the scenes were also entangled in their own power struggles, preventing any one of them from pressing their advantage. This unexpected reprieve allowed the swarm to endure nearly 20 years of relative calm, right up until the G-imposed deadline approached. Over these years, the swarm had gradually withdrawn 60% of their forces from the Riken system. The bases on the geological planets were mostly dismantled and relocated. However, the solar orbit base still retained a large contingent of forces. The base, floating in the star's orbit, didn't have the complications of underground structures and should have been the easiest to evacuate. But it housed 2 megastructure units, each over 3,000 kilometers in diameter. At the time the G revised their rules, these megastructures were already massive. Had they been mechanical constructs, disassembly would have taken at least a century, if not longer. Luo Wen had the capability to rapidly break them down and recover their materials. However, with no planetary surface to obscure them, the megastructures were completely exposed. Any movement or dismantling process would be plainly visible. To protect the swarm's secrets, Luo Wen had no choice but to slow the operation. He orchestrated an elaborate facade using space octopuses, creating the appearance of mechanical dismantling. This was also why the solar orbit base retained the largest portion of the swarm's forces. Even so, the deadline was fast approaching, and progress remained unsatisfactory. Despite 20 years of work, less than a third of the megastructures had been dismantled. The prospect of completing the task in the remaining time was nothing short of impossible. Meanwhile, the number of outsiders in the Riken system had multiplied several times over. They salivated over the sight of the swarm's megastructures in solar orbit. "It looks like the swarm won't be able to take these behemoths with them," one observer remarked. The G only gave them 20 years. Clearly, they had their eyes on these things from the start, another quipped. "This is entirely the swarm's fault. Such massive constructions forget the outer ring even in the middle or inner circles. There are few civilizations capable of building something like this." "Exactly. Look at all the people gathering here, how many of them are just waiting to scavenge whatever's left." Megastructures like these were rare not because of a lack of resources. Any civilization capable of colonizing other star systems could mine asteroids with ease. The rarest minerals on a home world were abundant in the vastness of space. However, constructing something of this scale required far more than raw materials. As a megastructure's size increases, so does its gravitational pull. Balancing internal gravitational forces to prevent the structure from collapsing inward required advanced knowledge of gravity and structural integrity. This foundational challenge alone was enough to block most civilizations from even attempting such feats. The swarm's megastructures were undoubtedly masterpieces. Despite having been partially dismantled, their value remained immense. While the swarm could hide some of their more advanced technologies, components like the bone armor and support structures could be studied and reverse-engineered through observation and measurement. This was why, as the deadline loomed closer, more and more foreign personnel flocked to the Riken system. Many hoped that a simple tour, a few photographs, or some gathered data could spark significant breakthroughs for their own civilizations. Chapter 429, Self-Destruction. Luo Wen was well aware of what those factions were scheming. The remnants of the megastructure had been left deliberately. He had a plan, one that might cause quite a spectacle, making it difficult to avoid the attention of other forces. But paradoxically, this presented a perfect opportunity. Sometimes, the most dangerous place could also be the safest, under the scrutiny of countless eyes, certain actions were easier to conceal. A month later, with only 3 months remaining before the 20-year deadline. Have the notifications been sent out? Luo Wen asked solemnly. Yes, Overlord. The announcements have been made. Good. The plan will proceed in 3 days. In the Riken system, chaos was brewing. Half a month earlier, the swarm had announced that, given the impending deadline, they were unable to dismantle the megastructure in time. After discussions within the swarm royal court, it was decided to destroy it in place through controlled demolition. The swarm set a date for the operation, warning all parties in the Riken system to cooperate, avoid approaching the site, and prepare adequate protective measures. Any consequences would be their responsibility. The announcement caused an uproar. The factions that had been waiting to scavenge the remains were outraged, accusing the swarm of being wasteful and unreasonable. If you don't want it, why not let us have a look, they protested angrily. Attempts were made to halt the swarm's actions, but to no avail. The megastructure was swarm property, and they held complete sovereignty over it. There was no legal basis to challenge their decision. Despite this, some determined minds found a new angle. A megastructure spanning over 2,000 kilometers undergoing self-destruction would undoubtedly release intense waves and radiation. While the foreign factions could weather such radiation safely aboard their ships, the potential impact on planet Riken's atmosphere and life forms was uncertain. Using the pretext of protecting the Riken's ecosystem, they demanded that the swarm halt the operation until simulations could confirm no environmental harm. Of course, stopping was out of the question. With only 3 months left before the deadline, delaying further would provide these factions with the excuse they needed to expel the swarm from the Riken system and seize the megastructure. The swarm played their hand well, announcing the demolition just half a month in advance. While objections were raised, the time frame was too short for any meaningful action under the rules. Thus, the swarm turned a deaf ear to the criticisms. 3 days passed quickly. During this time, external factions worked tirelessly to provoke the Riken, urging them to stand their ground and resist the swarm at all costs. The hope was that the demolition's shockwaves would cause severe damage to the Riken, giving these factions the justification they needed to retaliate against the swarm. However, this plan faced a critical flaw. Not only were the Riken's leaders far from foolish, but their government was already under the swarm's covered control. The overwhelming majority of the Riken parliament, from top to bottom, were intelligent entities in disguise, leaving only a token few exceptions. The Riken made a decisive and wise choice. They declared a system-wide holiday and moved everyone into protective facilities. Civilian and most military equipment were powered down to prevent unnecessary losses. The Riken's cautious response frustrated the agitators, who were powerless to coerce them further without exposing their true intentions. Any overt interference would only harm their own credibility. Overlord, all preparations are complete, Sarah reported, her tone composed. Luo Wen nodded at her words. His consciousness swept through the swarm network, issuing the final command. In the Riken system, the massive megastructure still loomed in the swarm's solar orbital base, its colossal frame extending over 2,000 kilometers. Positioned on the side away from the star, countless primordial bodies aligned themselves against the structure, exerting their collective strength to push it toward the star. As the primordial bodies pushed, the megastructure began to tremble, its massive form slowly shifting out of its orbit. Gradually, it started moving toward a closer position to the star. Didn't they say it was going to self-destruct? Are they pushing it into the star instead? One onlooker exclaimed. The idea of a self-destruction event promised salvageable debris, but incinerating it in the star left no chance of recovery. The swarm isn't holding back. They're not leaving anything for us, another muttered. TCH, why would they? They don't owe us anything. Hey, whose side are you on? I'm just here for business and to watch the show. I'm not part of you scavengers. The observers' chatter had no effect on the swarm's operation. The megastructure's speed increased steadily, its orbit tightening around the star as it drew ever closer. Overlord, everything is proceeding smoothly. The megastructure will reach its designated position in 20 hours, Sarah updated. Excellent, Luo Wen responded, his tone carrying a note of satisfaction. Time passed. The primordial bodies disengaged from the megastructure as its own systems activated. Massive amounts of energy began accumulating within it, visibly radiating from the structure. The energy levels climbed rapidly, and soon the megastructure started drawing power directly from the star itself. The monitoring equipment of the onlookers went haywire as alarms blared. The megastructure had transformed into a colossal bomb, teetering on the edge of detonation. What is the swarm trying to do? The observers questioned, bewildered. Why go through the trouble of pushing it toward the star and then loading it up with energy? This seems so redundant. Wait, the energy levels are too high. If it detonates now, planet Reincarnated will take serious damage. Record everything. This will be evidence against them. The swarm, however, had no intention of leaving behind any incriminating evidence. Despite its volatile appearance, the megastructure continued to hold together for several hours as it drew closer to the star. Its path eventually took it to the far side of the star, out of sight from planet Reincarnated. Finally, a brilliant white flash illuminated the system. While the megastructure was minuscule compared to the star beside it, the explosion it unleashed was monumental. The accumulated energy erupted in a blinding display of light and heat, so intense that even the star could not overshadow its brilliance. At the moment of detonation, Luo Wen made his move. From his position in a dimension beyond space, he exerted his power, guiding the explosion's energy to forcefully breach the boundaries of the physical universe. Under the cover of the radiant explosion, a small black spot emerged at the center of the blast. Deep, unfathomable, and ominous, it resembled an eye staring into the abyss. From the partially destroyed remains of the megastructure, a 2-meter-wide flesh pod shot out at high speed, hurtling toward the black void. Its trajectory suggested it was meant to enter the anomaly. However, something unexpected occurred. Just as the pod approached the black spot, the anomaly vanished abruptly. Caught off guard, the pod shot through the now empty space where the black spot had been. Without the protection of the megastructure, the pod's formidable defenses proved insufficient against the ferocious energy at the blast's epicenter. Within seconds, it was vaporized by the surrounding chaos. Chapter 430, New Skill. Seeing Luo Wen open his eyes, Sarah Kerrigan, who had been waiting patiently, quickly asked, "Overlord, was the plan successful?" Luo Wen didn't answer immediately. He frowned, shook his head, and fell into deep thought. Sarah knew this was not the time to disturb her overlord, so she quietly stood guard by his side. Suddenly, Luo Wen raised his eyebrows and said, "The plan failed. The time window for the tunnel was too short, and the seed didn't manage to enter. However, the good news is that my earlier theoretical hypothesis was correct. This plan is entirely feasible, and we still have another chance. When should we begin?" Sarah asked. "Make arrangements now," Luo Wen replied. "Dragging it out any longer may lead to unforeseen complications. In the meantime, until the megastructure reaches the designated position, do not disturb me. I need time to think." "As you command, Overlord," Sarah said. "This galaxy houses a supremely powerful force, one whose strength surpasses the swarm by an immeasurable margin. While the swarm holds immense potential, it needs time to fully grow, and Luo Wen was uncertain whether time was on their side. Could the swarm possibly match such a formidable opponent? For now, if a conflict were to break out with the Interstellar Technological Confederation or the New G race, there was no chance of victory. Moreover, losing such a war would mean even escape would be a luxury. The swarm's sublight speed lagged behind that of the New G race. Even if the gap were small, they would eventually be overtaken. With Luo Wen's meticulous personality, such a situation was intolerable. Even back when he was a bug the size of a fingernail, digging a nest required him to create 7 or 8 escape tunnels. Now, having grown immeasurably stronger, he was no less cautious. Overconfidence without an exit strategy was never his way. What he was doing now was preparing an escape route for himself and the swarm. Over the years, through various methods, the swarm's nodes had taken root and spread throughout the Interstellar Technological Confederation. Once their scale reached a certain threshold, Luo Wen could locate them and incorporate them into the swarm network, often gaining valuable information in the process. One such piece of intelligence caught Luo Wen's attention. Within the Confederation's territory, there existed a kind of tunnel capable of connecting vast distances. These tunnels allowed entities entering them to travel at speeds far exceeding that of light. Conceptually, they were strikingly similar to wormholes as Luo Wen understood them. The records described these wormholes as connecting black holes to white holes. In theory, the immense gravitational fields within wormholes should rip apart anything that entered. However, the New G race had discovered a peculiar property in material known as negative energy. By enveloping their ships in negative energy, they could stabilize and neutralize the wormhole's energy fields, enabling safe passage. However, gathering negative energy was difficult, and the ships themselves required specialized construction. Even for the new G-race, indiscriminate use of wormholes was impossible. Although these wormholes were far from the swarm's reach for now, their concept provided Luo Wen with plenty of inspiration. With collaborative brainstorming and the assistance of intelligent entities, Luo Wen quickly developed theoretical models of wormhole formation and operation. However, transforming theory into reality using conventional means was far beyond the swarm's current technological level. But that was not a problem. Luo Wen had always played with an edge. Luo Wen devoted nearly all his energy during this period to the study of wormholes. Since it was nearly impossible to catch up to the new G-race in a short amount of time using conventional means, he had to resort to unconventional methods to achieve a leapfrog breakthrough. To open and maintain a wormhole with a 1 km diameter would require energy equivalent to the total energy output of a medium-sized star system, a feat far beyond the current capabilities of the swarm. Fortunately, Luo Wen didn't need such a massive wormhole. All he required was a small, fleeting one just long enough to send the seed through. However, even for a wormhole of this scale, the amount of energy needed was still staggering. Additionally, gathering energy on such a massive scale would inevitably draw outside attention. The swarm was already in a precarious position. If their activities were discovered, it might force the hidden enemies behind the scenes to act prematurely. But there was always a solution. After brainstorming extensively, the megastructure self-destruction plan in the Riken star system was devised. Under the guise of a legitimate operation, Luo Wen could collect the necessary energy during the process. Although there were anomalies in the self-destruction steps, it would be difficult for anyone to associate it with wormhole creation. With the energy problem resolved, the next challenge was how to use that energy to open a wormhole. The swarm lacked the ability to create black holes, but Luo Wen discovered a clever workaround. In theory, wormholes exist 2 dimensions higher than the observable universe, which is why they can connect distant locations. While it's conceivable that even higher dimensional wormholes might exist, ones that connect not only different points in spacetime but even alternate universes, Luo Wen didn't need such capabilities at this stage. Luo Wen's relationship with this universe was difficult to describe. At the very least, there were intersections between him and the higher dimensions of this universe. These intersections allowed Luo Wen to exert limited influence over this universe. At first, Luo Wen attempted to simulate the effects of a black hole in higher dimensions to create a wormhole. However, he had overestimated himself. Right now, he was akin to a newborn. Perhaps one day in the future, he could achieve such feats, but for now, this was far beyond his current abilities. Disheartened but not defeated, Luo Wen turned his focus to the familiar swarm network. In higher dimensions, the concept of distance didn't exist. Thus, the swarm network could seamlessly connect distant locations and facilitate unhindered communication. However, this only applied within the swarm network. If the world of this universe represented reality, then the swarm network represented the virtual. The question was, could reality and the virtual intersect or even communicate? The answer was yes. Initially, Luo Wen attempted to bring objects from reality into the virtual world. These attempts were unsuccessful. Undeterred, he conducted numerous experiments, gradually identifying the underlying issues. His idea of moving reality into the virtual was fundamentally flawed, at least for now. With his current capabilities, reality and virtual could only intersect briefly. For instance, if his pocket represented the virtual, he couldn't store real beans in it for long. However, he could place beans in the pocket momentarily before taking them out again. In other words, objects from the real world could enter the swarm network but couldn't remain there for any extended period. This limitation, however, created an operational window. After countless trials, Luo Wen finally succeeded. A beetle disappeared before his eyes and reappeared 10 meters away out of thin air.